second half of the first day here on the plenary stage. I hope you're all nurtured and energized for the upcoming discussions. My name is Gunnar Hauptmann. I'm the head of program at the St. Gallen Symposium, and program at the symposium means essentially, or needs essentially, two things. On the one hand, we need topics of discussion which affect both generations, and we need topics that can be solved, or problems that can be solved by both generations in order to facilitate this cross-generational dialogue. The second thing we need is the voices that can actually help us to solve these issues. And this is where you can be a part of this journey as well. This is where we can need your help through all your network, your fantastic access. If you ever think of a person, in the course of the next 1.5 days, where you think, well, this person should really be on stage, a leader of tomorrow, a young politician, an entrepreneur, where you think this person should really contribute to the discussion, or a senior leader who should contribute to the discussion, perhaps doesn't want to, but particularly should for that instance, come and see me, come and see the team, and we're happy to connect and bring those people up on stage. You can come and see me anyway. I'm always happy to take notes, criticisms as well. I'll take them with a smile, so come and see me throughout the day. One of the issues that has been a cross-generational debate that we have heard from our community of leaders of tomorrow throughout our network has been obviously in the past weeks the topic of neutrality. And the question that keeps coming up is what does neutrality actually mean in a time that clearly calls for a firm stance? And this is what we would like to discuss in this session here today. We have a session that is comprised of 3 parts. We will have a short address at the beginning, then a exciting moderated panel discussion, and for the last part, one of our own students will join the stage and address the panel with questions of the next generation. So without further ado, I have the distinct honor now to welcome on stage President of the Swiss Confederation, Mr. Ignacio Cassis.
So, hello everybody. I'm glad to be here with you today. And I will speak about neutrality from the perspective of Switzerland, of course, from the Swiss government. And let's begin. I would be very happy to exchange with you later on stage. And, well, let's go. The subject I want to talk about is collaborative advantage. And collaborative advantage could not be more topical. We are meeting here today at a time when a radical unilateral action is being met with a resolutely multilateral response. Russia's brutal war of aggressions against Ukraine was and remains radically unilateral. It violates state sovereignty, it violates international laws, it violates humanity, it violates the peace order. The unified response by the Western democracies to this aggression has been resolutely multilateral. Within days, a framework of sanctions against the aggressor was in place. While the sanctions are extensive, clearly, there are also limits to them. They were not intended to prevent the war, nor are they now able to stop it. They are limited in scope. Regretfully, they also affect many people who are not responsible for the war, and yet they do isolate the aggressor. Switzerland has fully adopted the sanctions and stands on the side of international law, and against injustice. On the side of self-determination of independent nations, on the side of solidarity, on the side of values that are also our values, on the side of freedom. The stand we have taken is that of a small and neutral, but by no means passive, state. Yet the Federal Council, the Swiss government, could not take this step without fundamental considerations. What many seem emotionally right must also be rationally justifiable. Our moral obligation must also be matched by our responsibility in terms of state policy, both towards our own citizens and towards the community of nations. This shows that for Switzerland, a small, neutral state, multilateralism entails both constructive room for maneuver and conflicting objectives. This is what I want to focus on today, to show what a government must weigh up when making a decision, to show how multilateralism relates to our neutrality and how it relates to democracy, to sovereignty, and to federalism, which makes decision at the lowest rather than the highest level possible. Ladies and gentlemen, there are those who see Switzerland's identity in its sovereignty. Multilateralism makes them skeptical. For others, it is only logical that there are international problems that can only be solved across borders in coordinated and joint manner without compromising our own sovereignty. In themselves, sovereignty, neutrality, and solidarity are not controversial. The question is how to bring the three together in a way that it is acceptable to the majority. The mere fact that we have adopted the sanctions has provoked a big debate about neutrality in Switzerland. Some are already planning a popular initiative to save neutrality based on a narrow understanding of it. Others have already thought about a closer relationship with NATO in order to provide Switzerland with a protective shield. Their understanding of neutrality is much broader. Many citizens in Switzerland think that the Federal Council made the right decision. Because when choosing between freedom and oppression, one cannot be neutral in the sense of indifference. In Switzerland, some people have a rather dynamic and others a much more static understanding of our state system. Even if a clear decision is needed at the end of the day, such conflicting perspectives have to be taken seriously. Direct democracy as a system of general participation leaves the important decisions to the people. Multilateral decisions, on the other hand, are not, or not always, or not entirely in our hands. Sovereignty protects states, especially small states, from external interference. It is part of our DNA, and yet it is not absolute. And neutrality, after all, must be credible. First, in our own country, where it has an almost mythical status, but also in the international community, whose interest it also serves. Otherwise, it will not be accepted. Nor would it be accepted if Switzerland simply sat on the sidelines, because neutrality goes hand in hand with solidarity. The strictly binding part of our neutrality is the law of neutrality, which prohibits us from intervening militarily. This means that we can neither send in troops nor deliver weapons. The law of neutrality is, so to speak, the cornerstone of our neutrality. The part that is constantly adapted to the geopolitical reality is our policy of neutrality, not the law of neutrality. The policy of neutrality is an instrument for our security policy, our solidarity with the international community, and the defense of peace, which also means peace for Switzerland. Neutrality policy is not a dogma, but a flexible instrument for our foreign policy and our security policy. This is why there is room for maneuver. Russia has violated the prohibition of the use of force enshrined in international law so seriously that Switzerland's failure to act would have played into the hands of the aggressor. This served as a yardstick for the Federal Council decisions. And that is why Switzerland cannot and must not accept this war without taking action, and must take a stand. This is our humanitarian tradition. Ladies and gentlemen, the sanctions are not a direct expression of multilateralism. After all, Switzerland took its decisions as a sovereign nation. But they are indirectly related to multilateralism. Some of their effects can only be achieved together in a unified way through collaborative efforts. There are complex, overarching transnational issues with implications for humanity as a whole. Problems which are important, yet which no country can solve on its own, such as climate change, pandemics, natural disasters, global economic crisis, cybersecurity, mass migration, and once again, war of aggression that trample the existing international order underfoot. Multilateral action is an imperative on all these fronts because there is no alternative, and because the consequences of inaction will ultimately affect the generation that organized this symposium here today and choose the topic. When people join forces, they achieve better results. This is nothing new. It is something we are taught in kindergarten in Switzerland, one for all for one. Ladies and gentlemen, of course, imperfection is everywhere in our world. It is also intrinsic to world politics, to multilateralism. But what conclusion do we draw from this? That politics has failed? That we should only work with groups that do everything just the way we would like them to do? That we should throw up our hands in resignation? Surely not. Resignation is neither an answer nor an attitude, nor does it solve even one of the challenges facing humanity. This is why the Federal Council's response is that we will play an active role in making the multilateral institutions fit for the future. That we will actively shape developments with all the modesty of a small state. That we will step up our efforts to involve not only state actors, but also essential non-state actors in the multilateral orders, such as the ICRC, academia, business or civil society, every organization that is dedicated to achieving the same goals, for example, in the fights against poverty or climate problems. That we are ready to take more responsibility for an effective and democratic multilateralism. Most notably, with our first ever candidacy for a non-permanent seat for Switzerland on the UN Security Council. I said earlier that in action, it's hardest the generation that choose the topic of this symposium. You, the 30 members of the International Students Committee and the 450 student volunteers, you all are representing this generation. To conclude, I would like to address you in particular. After all, intergenerational dialogue is one of the main pillars of this event, and I look forward to discussing these topics with you afterwards. We live in a world that is growing together and drifting apart at the same time. Growing together because of digitalization, globalization, and the countless ways we can now communicate with each other. Drifting apart because of growing polarization and disparities, and the emergence of opposing blocs. Such contradictions are part of the human condition and of the world. This is the world you want to and will have to shape as you grow older. It is also a world where why will matter more than precisely how. Because those who are always in favor in principle, but object when it comes down to the details, will miss the boat. And that is the reason this why is such a powerful driver for new action. For action that starts with the meaning and then looks for the most effective way to the goal. For action that breaks old paradigms because new ones are both possible and necessary. In our highly interconnected, constantly interacting world, without technological boundaries, the best way to tackle the big questions of mankind is to join forces. Never before has any generation been better educated, more prosperous, more diverse, open-minded, mobile, and more multi-optional, and therefore less frustration tolerant than your generation. And this is a problem. Nor has any generation known more countries, more ways of life, and more about diversity than your generation. No generation has ever been so united in calling for global solutions than your generation. You represent a generation that is ready to take responsibility, that does not think in terms of hierarchies, but in terms of solution cycles, that is more conscious of habitats than of borders. In short, you represent the generation that stands for the future and that deserves our trust. Thank you for your attention.
President Cassis, thank you very much for your remarks. We'll have time to discuss this now together. May I ask you to go ahead and take your seat? And as Gunnar announced earlier, we'll also have the opportunity to hear from the next generation when we ask our ISC member, Dylan Feuerstein, to join us in about 20 minutes. But for now, I'm very excited to bring up to stage someone who bridges these two generations in the Austrian Minister for Europe and Constitutional Affairs. Minister Carolina Edstadler, won't you join us on stage? Now, the president doesn't need much introduction, but we heard a few words from Gunnar Hauptmann. But I do have to introduce our newest co-panelist in Minister Edstadler. She is, I think, a rising star in the ÖVP, we can say. In her relatively short time now as a minister, she's managed to serve three federal chancellors. And that's mostly because the chancellors have changed, not that she has quickly aged. But she was previously a member of the European Parliament. She started her career as a state secretary in the Ministry of the Interior. But I like particularly her brief, this connection for our topic today, this connection of EU affairs and constitutional affairs, because as you will all be aware, the neutrality of Switzerland goes back to 1815. The neutrality of Austria goes back to October 26, 1955, and a constitutional decree. So when we ask ourselves, what is the future of neutrality for these two countries? We're also talking about, as the president underlined, foundational values of these two countries that still have their own variants of neutrality. I don't know how you're feeling these days, both of you, but I wake up very early and very nervous because every time I look at the pictures, and again this morning, we had a ray of hope in terms of the evacuation from Mariupol, and you mentioned the phenomenal work. And I would like to say that again, not just because Peter Maurer is a personal friend, but also because I truly think that what the Red Cross is doing as frontline negotiators, the people who work truly the hardest trying to negotiate human access, humanitarian access and relief, has been very moving. And yet the immediate response by the other side to keep the shelling up, to squeeze human life out of Ukraine, I find it, frankly, almost too hard to bear. So with the two of you, I want to discuss very different conclusions that so-called neutral states have come to. The Swedes, the Finns, both with borders and close proximity, of course, to Russia and the Russian Federation, have taken a very different approach in these last few weeks. In fact, we could see a decision by Finland as early as May 12th. That's next week. We've seen the Danes, who are now classically dropping their opposition to joining the military component of the European Union. And so I want to discuss with you and go a little deeper in terms of how this debate on neutrality in both of your countries goes further. You mentioned, of course, the historic decision by the Swiss to join the sanctions, but clearly the sanctions packages are likely even to go further. We now have a phased embargo on energy. And the question to you, President Cassis, you mentioned it, all for one and one for all, that Latinate expression that effectively also summarizes Article 5. But again, you're interpreting neutrality as a policy. What if neutrality is a policy in addition to something that anchors the Swiss nation? And we do know that despite Switzerland's refusal to offer ammunition to the Cheetah system that the Germans were trying to send to Ukraine, in World War I, Switzerland took a slightly different approach and did offer weapons to France and Great Britain. So as you're thinking through how this goes further and how you work with the policy of neutrality, is there another red line for Switzerland in which this debate would change, would deepen? You would think about renegotiating a wider sense of neutrality?
If you look at neutrality, you have to go back in history, of course. You cannot just look at neutrality in the last 2 months and try to understand everything in these 2 months. Switzerland was imposed, more or less, to be neutral from the neighboring countries because they needed a buffer zone between them, since they were not always in very peaceful relations. And
everybody knows what you mean.
This is a diplomatic way of saying it. And furthermore, Switzerland was not very interesting because we had so many mountains, so many snow without natural resources. We didn't even have a king or an emperor like Austria, and so we were really poor people. But geographically, in the heart of the continent, and geographically, geography is politics. So this is why Switzerland has become neutral, because big powers around us decided us to be neutral in order to be sure that there is some way of living together. And we were actually in Switzerland very well protected by the law of neutrality, which was decided in 1815. But in order to be neutral, you have to be credibly neutral. You have to be credible discussing with the international community. They have to recognize that you are neutral. You can say, I'm neutral, but if the others are not recognizing you, then the question is finished. So we have all the time to develop policies, and that what we know, the neutrality policy, that make neutrality credible and that make our foreign policy credible. The reason of being neutral was the main reason of becoming Switzerland a high power in soft power, in diplomacy, in building bridges, in good offices, and all the things we are known to be able to do. This is a consequence of being neutral, or of the must of being neutral. The fact that the Swiss government decided to adopt the EU sanctions was not an easy decision. We had to prove the impact on neutrality law, and how would it affect our policy of neutrality. And secondly, how would it affect our policy of diplomacy? We could imagine that such a big impact could affect that Switzerland would be able in the future to again offer good offices for the world. And this is what we are known for. The government decided in 4 days to take this decision. I've said in my speech, because the violation of the international law was incredibly massive. And we couldn't just tolerate that in a modern Europe, such things are still possible, especially from a big power belonging to the European continent, being member of the UN Security Council, permanent member of the UN Security Council, being member of the OSCE organization, which is in Vienna, and it was just impossible to tolerate that. And we accepted to pay the price for that. And of course, at this moment, in the Swiss population, it was a huge discussion between those who interpret the neutrality in a narrow or in a broad sense, as I told in my speech. Right. And now we have a parliament who is discussing almost every day about that. And this discussion will accompany us in the next, I guess, 2, 3, 4 years, maybe. So we are preparing a report in order to analyze the development of the policy of neutrality during the decades. I mean, the last state of the art of the Swiss neutrality was made in 1993. It was before we joined the UN, 2002. So in joining the UN, we accept to adopt automatically the sanctions of the UN Security Council. It means we are not sovereign to decide what we like to do. Now, you said before it was a historical decision by the US sanction. Yes, but not forget that we adopted in the last 10 years almost 80% of the EU sanctions against Syria, against Libya, against many, many other countries. But it was less important in a popular sense of the term important. It was very important for the people there, but for the domestic policy debate, it was less important. So, and when we say we have to update, to adjust our policy of neutrality to the times that are changing, I mean that we have to adapt our way of interpreting neutrality to our times in order to still be credible for the international community.
So let me just ask a sub-question to that, and then I want to bring Minister Edstadler into the conversation. You have your colleagues from the International Committee of the Red Cross, in part with many other organizations, investigating whether we're seeing genocidal actions by the Russian Federation, its soldiers, across the territory of Ukraine. Again, is there a moment, a fact, if that is proven beyond reasonable doubt, that on issues like weapons delivery, again, we've seen this discussion with the Germans, you could find different variations where that as a policy, which I think underlining again, neutrality as a policy, I think that's such an interesting argument as opposed to sort of a, just a fealty to a constitution or a constitutional concept. Do you see, given the debate that you are observing, that you're leading in terms of public responsibility, Switzerland going beyond? Is there a red line that you see that Switzerland might go beyond what it is currently doing?
Of course, this is the core of neutrality, the legal framework of neutrality, and there are fear topics on this core. We cannot be part of a military alliance. This is just forbidden. We cannot. This would be the revolution of Switzerland if we would join the NATO. We cannot export weapons or troops in a country which is involved in international conflicts, and we cannot let such transportation of troops or weapons go through our territory. These are red lines. We can just not do that. This is the core of neutrality, the law of neutrality. But many other things, adopting sanctions. We are very active on the international law level. We were among the first asking for looking after possible alleged war crimes and so on. This is in our interest to have a strong multilateral institution that can do everything is necessary in order to empower international laws, to execute international laws. And this has nothing to do with neutrality. We have values in our constitution, values for human rights, for democracy, for a law of order and international laws and so on. And these values, this is the core business of Switzerland, defending its values. And if somebody is affected with the same values, well, then we are in the same boat.
It's a perfect segue because, of course, the Chancellor of Austria said, in the view of this egregious overreach, this egregious violation of Ukrainian sovereignty, despite our provisions and our understanding of constitutional neutrality, we cannot be value-free, wertfrei. And we have to find a new concept. And it's particularly interesting in the Austrian case because, as we noted, Switzerland seeing itself as an international bridge, Austria has, in many ways, been seeing itself try to be a bridge to Russia. In 2018, we had the Austria Institute open in Moscow. Then there were some, let's say, now in hindsight, less favorable views of Austrian politicians interfacing with Moscow. But now we've seen the Chancellor go to Moscow as one of the few Western leaders, seek a conversation with Vladimir Putin, possibly seek, and you'll tell us, whether there's a diplomatic strategy behind us. But as we were looking at these last few weeks, it seemed Austria on the energy issues, on the sanctions possibly, could it be, along with the Hungarians, potentially one of the places where the sanctions regime begins to break down long term? What is your interpretation now of modern neutrality in the Austrian case?
Well, first of all, there were many questions within your segue to bringing me into the discussion. And I would like to start by saying that I think it takes place, this discussion, at the right time and also at the right place. And I would also like to start by explaining briefly what Austrians' neutrality means to us. It has not a mythical status, as you mentioned in your speech, but it has a very high value for citizens. And of course, and you mentioned it also, it has been introduced in 1955. It guaranteed Austria independence. The times of the Mare Nostrum are history, unfortunately. Don't tell the Italians. But it also brought us prosperity and peace for decades of time. And this is something where I think that we should not stop now because the 24th of February shattered the world and the belief in the world order. This is really something very concrete. The neutrality brought Austria not only prosperity, it brought Vienna, or it made Vienna to a place for negotiations, for dialogues, for many international organizations chosen their seat in Vienna, and that is something really important and valuable. You also mentioned in this regard that for Switzerland it's very important, and also for Austria it's very important. But I think there are differences, distinctions between Switzerland and Austria. Of course, we are a member of the European Union. And for me, as a Minister for European Affairs, it is also very clear that with the membership of the European Union in 1995, it was the first real big change of living neutrality in Austria. But still, the core of neutrality is there. It is compatible with the European Union's membership. We have to take part of the European security and defense policy, of course, and security policy. We are doing that, of course, actively. And that means also that we cannot contradict things, that we have to impose sanctions, that we have to put humanitarian aid, for example, and that we can do one thing when it comes to the lethal weapons, especially now for Ukraine, that we abstain constructively. And this goes back to the Irish Protocol. And we are not the only neutral state in the European Union. It's, for example, also Malta and the Irish Republic, so the Republic of Ireland, sorry. So I just visited both countries and discussed these topics also, and this is important. But I think in times like that, where we are facing a lot of challenges, where we are seeing violation of human rights, where Russia was, for a good reason, was kicked out of the Council of Europe. Nevertheless, we can't talk with Russia now in this regard, but we have to talk over Russia, and that's, of course, not a good way, but it is like it is. We have to stick, on the one hand, to our values. We have to protect our values, but we also have to live neutrality in an active way, and I think that is what Austria is doing. And, very important, we are neutral in a military way. And here are many similarities also with Switzerland. But we are not neutral towards war. We are not neutral towards atrocities and the violation of human rights. And we are not neutral when it comes to terrorism. And so we try to live, and I think so far we are doing quite well, neutrality in a way that we are, nevertheless, taking a clear voice, that we are voicing clearly what we are seeing, and that we are against that. And that is, and I would like to conclude with that, why our Chancellor also went not only to Kiev, but also to Moscow to talk to Putin, because we need diplomacy. It is nice. Is it nice to talk to Putin? I think not. But it is necessary to talk to him and to tell him in the face that what he is doing won't work in a Western world.
Can you shed some light? There was some discussion on whether that Austrian initiative would continue. Can you shed some light? And now you're hardly talking to a secret audience here. So, you know, of course, we're all waiting for what is going on behind the scenes, but I don't know if all of these people can keep a diplomatic secret. But this idea that, you know, I think every strand of hope we have now is a strand of hope we're willing to play. God knows, for a millisecond, the Germans were even entertaining the idea of Gerhard Schröder delivering critical messages to the Russian president, which we quickly abandoned, thank goodness. Not editorializing at all. Is there, seriously, on the Austrian side, reflection in, of course, you know, the very close conference calls, conversations that you're having with your own colleagues within the Union, but of course, the leaders of the EU Council are having among one another, that we begin to identify specific roles for specific partners in the EU? I mean, more widely spoken, of course, we're working on triangulation with the Americans, speaking to the Chinese, speaking with the Indians. Sashi Tharoor shared a little bit about, you know, what the wider role of former non-aligned states can be, and that's sort of a different form of neutrality. That being said, is there a role for Austria in all of this that goes beyond the Chancellor's visit?
Of course, there's a role for Austria, and I think we proved in the last years, in the last decades, that Austria was a good place of negotiations, that we, of course, could also offer that. The Chancellor was the first Chancellor and head of state of or government who went really directly to Moscow. And I think this offered also somehow a ring of visits. And we need the visits of many heads of state and government, of all the presidents of the European Union, to do so of other countries. Maybe also the Pope should travel to Kiev and to Moscow and talk with Putin. We should not forget that we have to do everything and to try everything to stop this war, to getting back to peace, to rebuilding the country in all its senses, from the buildings onwards to the economy and so on and so forth. You know that Ukraine also lodged an application to becoming a member of the European Union. I think in an emotional way, this is very important also for the citizens. And I think Austria can play a very important role and is playing a very important role in this field also. But the most important role is for the EU, and the EU has to keep its unity. And that's not naturally given. That's something we have to work hard from day to day. You mentioned the sanction packages. It is concretely clear for us, crystal clear for us, that we are imposing the sanctions also. But we have to work on that. Because, you know, it's not nice having the need to say that, but Austria is dependent on Russian gas. And we can simply not afford to have a gas embargo. And so we have to put ourselves in the shoes also of other member states, what they maybe cannot afford. Because we see that there is the need to have the sanctions for obviously a longer time, and it's not a question of weeks or of months. And Austria is highly participating in this dialogue, and we do everything which could contribute to, let's say, a ceasefire, humanitarian corridors, to bring peace in the end, and everyone has to do its utmost to do so.
Because we're about to hand over to Dylan Feuerstein and questions from you, from the audience, from the next generation. I think across Europe, the greatest pressure that governments are facing right now is coming from the generation of young people on the streets. They're in the streets. They want answers. And not only do they want answers, they want to know what they can do. And so to both of you, they would like to, in general, see more. I was at the Burgtheater speaking on a panel discussion similar to ours with 400 Austrians on a Sunday morning. So there seems to be more percolating under the surface than what we've previously done. Can both of you, and we'll start with you, President Cassis, talk about how, as you're having this conversation at the heart of the political elite and the part of political entities, how that intergenerational component, that push from Switzerland's youth, from Austria's youth, to say, look, this is the red line, this is the moment, the watershed moment, the Zeitenwende that we in our generation will see, we perceive. How do you respond to that?
Up to them to decide. We are in a direct democracy. The people have to decide. We can deliver ideas, we can deliver proposals, but it's up to them to decide. Listen, I spoke in my speech from frustration tolerance. And you were, they need answers, they need answers. They have to look for answers. They have to look for answers. We live in a world where every citizen cannot just choose his menu and say, I want menu 3, point. Somebody has to deliver that. Democracy means, me too. What can I do for my state? What can I do for having a good answer to that? Manifestation, going on the street, thinking together, make proposals, political proposals, being active in the young parties. I mean, we have structures. Democracy has structures. Just be active in the structures. Or make a revolution. You can also try to make a revolution. It's also possible. But just do something. Just to sit down.
Who is applauding?
I'm sorry to be so direct, but just to sit down and choose menu I, menu 2, menu. I mean, this is not a way to make politics. Politics means bringing many people to get the same goal. This is a hard way. This is how we look at every people here. Everybody has its own way of thinking, mindset, own tradition, religion, and so on. And how can I find an idea where most of those people here in this room would be would be supporting for the future? It's easy to say, this is wrong, I have to have this solution. I have to fight for the solution. I have to convince you and your daughter and your family. Otherwise, it's just a solution for me, but not for you. And this is something which is incredibly lacking today. We have such a comfortable situation just to pretend. Maybe in a kingdom where a very powerful king can decide everything in an illuminated way, maybe it would be a solution. But in democracy, it's not that way. In a direct democracy, not even less.
The great nation of Switzerland might be in for quite a revolution, more than it bargained for. Dylan, we're going to go ahead and bring you on stage logistically because you get a chair as well. And so as the chair appears, I will ask the same question of Karin Edstadler. How are you addressing the next generation, the needs of the next generation, the fears of the next generation, but also, giving them an opportunity to have a seat at the table in helping you redefine what neutrality should be?
Beside the things President mentioned already, political parties, discussions, even revolutions, I wouldn't go so far. There is one instrument we started before the COVID crisis started and before the invasion of Russia in Ukraine started, and this was the Conference on the Future of Europe. And this is a very, very important instrument to participate in the next goals we have to achieve. It's very easy to criticize politics, and we see a lot of criticism, and okay, we can stand that, no worries. You can criticize us, and we will handle that, but we can only do what you want if you tell us what you want. And okay, in Switzerland you have the direct democratic elements, quite more serious than we do have, but also in Austria we have some instruments, not always used, but more and more used. What I mean is the participation is the key, and the interest for the young generation. And I was, during my 2 years in the Conference on the Future of Europe, I prolonged it a bit. I started already in June 2020 because a diplomat in Austria called me impatient and demanding. Okay, I take it. I talked with many young people especially, and it's very interesting. They have a clear focus. They have a clear imagination of the future. And then it's up to us politicians to do these things. Sometimes we have to tell us, okay, it's a nice idea, but we can't do it because we need unanimity in the European Union and we do not find it. Okay, fair enough. But I think if we are open and clear that some things cannot be done, it's better than saying, okay, thanks for the idea, we are gone. So the participation is the most important thing, and in the European Union we are seeing that the Conference on the Future of Europe, the first part is coming to an end, but the real work is starting now. And I would really like to encourage everyone to stay on track, to do discussions in your own constituencies, in the school classes, at university, and bring the ideas to the politicians. Why should we be the ones who are knowing everything? That's not the case. We are human beings as all the others also, and we do our utmost to change the future in a way that we can live with it in the best way. And again, we are not knowing which challenges are ahead of us. Only one thing, like the European Green Deal, is very accurate at the moment because we need energy diversification. And we started already, but we are far from an end, and it will be a lot of work in the future.
The fallibility of politicians, the ability of others to challenge that view always runs into the moment of time and the question of time and the lives lost in Ukraine and potentially more if this exacerbates and gets worse. But Dylan is the impatient member of this panel. He's a student of law and economics here. He's in charge. He's been in charge of all of you coming from India and Japan as he's been planning this conference. So welcome to the panel. Dylan, you will moderate our Q&A and be impatient with us.
Thank you very much. Yes, maybe first of all, to start, I would love to pose a question myself before I give it over to the audience, especially now since you've mentioned the participation. For example, the international exchange of the young generation such as exchange programs for students, have always been very important and acted as bridge builders. Now, this young generation is sanctioned as well. For example, here, we do not have any Russian participants, also young participants, since they aren't allowed to travel to Switzerland. Now, isn't it counterproductive to exclude the young Russian generation our hopes rely on?
That's fair enough to ask that, and I'm coming from the tradition of the Council of Europe, so I was working at the European Court of Human Rights for nearly 2 years, and I always saw the advantages of having, for example, countries like Russia, but also Turkey, Azerbaijan, so-called far eastern states within this council to have the opportunity to talk with them and not over them. And I was really deeply hurt emotionally when Russia was excluded, not because of Putin, because he really deserves it to be excluded. But the citizens are the ones who have no further the possibility to lodge a application at the European Court of Human Rights, for example. And that's really something which is hard, which might be unfair, but on the other hand, we do not have another chance than isolate the Russian Federation, because Putin is the president of the Russian Federation. And what I do say always is we have to support citizens in Russia. We have to support them to stand up. And I know I can say that easily, sitting in a chair here on a stage in a country which is independent, which has democracy, rule of law, where not a policeman will bring me out of the room and arrest me without giving me any sheet and without saying me where I am. So, but nevertheless, I see no other way than encouraging them, and we saw that they are really courageous, that they were demonstrating against Putin and for peace, and that they were arrested on that purpose. And yes, it is unfair. So let's do everything and join our forces to end this war. And I add, I don't have a solution at the moment, but in smaller steps, with sanctions and all the other things we are trying to do, I think we can be, we can reach that goal again. We have to. There is no alternative.
Thank you very much. Maybe Austria acts as a bridge builder in this case, as you mentioned before. Now over to the audience. I see a question there in front. I think there should be a microphone
coming behind you.
Thank you very much. My name is Lisa Jasko. I'm a member of Ukrainian Parliament, and I want to think that this panel is happening with such a background of my Ukrainian flag, but with the Swiss also part of the flag. This is very important. My question is very connected, of course, to the reality of my country and something that we are discussing right now. Before the war has started, there were honestly many foreign politicians with whom I had the conversation that would tell me, Lisa, why don't your government, your parliament, your president just make a compromise on some part of Ukrainian territory and then give it to Russia, or of course it was said in a very diplomatic way, and then you won't have a war. It was very shocking for me to hear that. But now we are already on the stage when we are talking about what do we do with all of that? Because it hurts, it affects everyone. And I'm very grateful that in this panel we are talking about the deep values and what needs to be done for the future to build the international system that really works. I'm a member also of the delegation to the Council of Europe, and I know that unfortunately many international organizations are very dysfunctional right now because there is simply no tools that can protect peace and ensure that the war doesn't start again. So my question is, what both of you think about the international cooperation in the future? What the organizations, whether they should be reformed, or it should be something completely new, that we really manage to have the tools that protect peace. Based on things that we just discussed, on the principles, I'm very happy to hear that it was said that what feels emotionally right can be also rationally justified in terms of the principle and the values. If we want to have peace, let's do something that will bring that peace, but not closing our eyes on aggressor, but making sure that this aggression is stopped and doesn't repeat. But what tools do we have? Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. President Cassis.
Yeah, thank you for this very, very straight to the point comment. The question of what can the international community, what can do the international community, what will it do? I guess I never seen in my life almost such a tremendous and unified and compact response from the international community like in this war. And for us, it is our mindset, it is absolutely normal. The values that have been violated are our values. Freedom is our value. It is exactly the same values we are inscripted in our constitution. But if you look at the map, at the world map, which country supported the decision, the resolution at the UN General Assembly in New York, then you have another picture of the world. Then you see what's going on in Africa, in Asia, in Southeast Asia, and the colors are changing. You see a very compacted Europe, which is threatened, and then you see the rest of the world not being very clear. And when you are talking about international community, and which country you're thinking of? What I want to say is, we will, in the European continent, independently of being or not member of the European Union, we will act together. We will do everything together what is necessary to recover, for the recovery period of the country. We will do everything which is necessary now. We are doing everything which is possible and necessary now to have humanitarian corridors, to work for a ceasefire. We are working day by day for that. Many, many countries. There are many initiatives are doing that. This is the international community when we talk about international community. But this is not the real international. This is part of the international community. It's the European community. And what's going on now in your country will affect us for the years to come in order to, and we will have to rethink our security policy of the continent. I'm sure this will tremendously affect the European Union. The Minister of Austria already said, think about Finland, think about Sweden. They are rethinking about their security. Should they join the NATO? Yes, no. What does it mean this for neutrality? Austria already had made an important choice to join the EU according to neutrality. We never made this choice according to neutrality because we don't think it is compatible with that. But what's going on is a disruptive change in our history in the continent. But again, we do not have to be wrong in our judgment. It is not the world community. It is the European community. And when I spoke to I was in Japan 2 weeks ago, they are very concerned, but they are almost the only Asian country so concerned with like-minded values like we have here in Europe. Every other country, Southeast Asia and China, I won't speak about China, but many other countries are observing, are tactical thinking, which opportunities are created by this new geopolitical situation. They have not the same emotional and value-based support that the European community is giving now to this war. Because we know it exactly that if you are losing now this war and you let the Russians make a step ahead, the next one will be, I don't think Austria, but the Balkan countries, Poland, and then Austria, and then Switzerland. And so we know it's quite exactly what's going on according to this mindset. This is the reason why also we are very engaged, of course, in order to help your population, but we also help ourselves in helping your population. And this is exactly what you're trying to do. But unfortunately, I do not think that the value-based world, the European together with the US, created after World War II, will be the eternal, the future choice of this world. I just don't believe it, because we see huge countries, China, India, developing in other ways of thinking the world, in our ways of it. For us, is democracy a religious question? For them, not. And this is a huge difference. And we are waking up from a situation we couldn't even imagine in my generation. And now we are waking up 70 years after World War II. Maybe the values are not so universal as we wanted them to be. It's not enough that we say they are universal for them to be universal. And this is the difficult times we are living now. And this is the reason why I was speaking about disruptive changes. And we are rethinking, we have to rethink, this will impact even the relations between Switzerland and the European Union, because of course we have to rethink these things, and we don't know in which direction. I don't want now to speculate or to make it, but just in order to how deep the thinking and discussion is going on at this moment.
Because we only have a few more minutes left, I want to have you comment, of course, Minister Edstadler, but Dylan, if I can take the prerogative of you doing a speed round of questions, because I'm sure we're going to have them, and they can be questions only. Otherwise, we're going to mess everything up.
Thank you very much. I'm Floramante S.J. Ponce. I'm from the Philippines. I would like to thank President Casas for explaining how, why, and when neutrality does work. But my question is very simple. Based on your experience, and I would like to hear more, when does not neutrality work? Thank you. Based on your experiences.
Dylan, I don't know if you saw, but there's a hand way back there in the black of black. Can somebody get a microphone to that raised pen all the way to the end? Yes, raise that pen higher. Well done.
Perfect, yeah.
Sure. Hi, I'm Liam, and live in Vienna, so I guess Wahlösterreicher. But my question is on the scalability of neutrality. Should other countries also be neutral, or does the neutral status of Switzerland and Austria rely on other countries not being neutral?
Okay, good. Provocative question at the end. Over to you. You finish it off.
A great question to finish up this session, actually. So maybe first, President Cassis, a few words to that.
So, I won't take too much time in order to let the floor also to my colleague. Neutrality is not such a thing you can just switch off and switch on, dependently on your mood, on your... This is the reason why I told you before, we have to go back to history, why you are neutral. This is a step-by-step construction over decades, over centuries. And you can just, you can maybe cancel it from in 1 minute. But I'm not sure this will cancel the neutrality mindset of the population living in neutral countries. And for many generations, part of our identity is neutrality. Neutrality in the military sense of neutrality. We won't begin any war. We won't start any war. We won't export any war material, any weapons, any troops in countries being involved in international conflicts, and. This is the way we are thinking, this is our identity. But of course, in order to explain that what I'm speaking of, we have to have a policy, we have to have a communication, we have to take decisions that protect ourselves in accordance to the Constitution, to our values, as we said before. And this is the way we make our neutrality credible. Now the question, just an example of neutrality being violated. No idea, not in Switzerland. We don't have any war almost, we don't have been violated in our neutrality for 500 years. Our borders are the same, has been the same in the last 500 years. We had a civil war 170 years ago, small one, but nevertheless a civil war. And this was the reason why, from a constitution of a federation of states, we made a federal state. But otherwise, of course, I can't answer your question because I don't know in the history if such a thing has been made to Switzerland. To other countries in the world, I don't know. You should ask an historian about that.
Well, we're going to ask the Austrian.
Absolutely.
Well, first of all, I would like to reflect to the Ukrainian question raised by you, because you asked, and I would like to reflect on that, if we have to adapt our international instruments to guarantee peace. And after the 24th of February, it's clear, I think, yes. But so far, I thought we have the instruments to guarantee peace, prosperity, and freedom within Europe, at least, because we know in other parts of the world we have war, and we are looking at that like it is far apart, and now it is in the middle of Europe. So yes, we have to, but you know also that there have been, since the last decades of years, attempts to change the order in the United Nations Security Council, for example, because this reflects still a post-Second World War order, and it was not possible so far because Russia played a role in that, or plays still a role in that, and they have a veto. So it is not so easy to find an answer on your question. The first and foremost is now to have ceasefire in Ukraine, to uphold the solidarity for Ukrainian people, to uphold the solidarity of the whole European Union towards Ukraine, because, and I can only second what the President already said, you're of course fighting for the European values now, for our European way of living, and we are seeing that. It is clear that we have to stand at your side. So the answer is not easy, and it is not there for the next months and maybe not years, but we have to work on that. And I told you how I'm hurt when I think of the Council of Europe not only losing Russia, but losing the possibility for people lodging an application at the European Court of Human Rights. That's the real loss. And there we have to work how to restore that again. Regarding neutrality of other countries, I would say it's of course a national question of every country. In the European Union, you see at least 3 countries which are neutral. And no, I would not say that we are relying on the other countries who are not neutral, which are not neutral, because we are doing a lot. We already adapted how we live our neutrality since we became a member of the European Union. And we are standing in solidarity. And everyone has to do the things that can restore peace. And I can only say that humanitarian aid is, of course, as much as important as the delivery of lethal weapons to defend the borders of Ukraine. And the first thing, humanitarian aid, we are doing in a really big amount. When it comes to Austria itself, I would say this was more than a wake-up call. This was an alarm. Because, of course, as a Minister of the Constitutional Affairs, I'm also saying we have the need from the Constitution to defend our country, also by our own. And at the moment, we are adapting our military services, and we are raising the budget in this regard.
How will neutrality adapt? Endogenous pressure, exogenous pressure, but certainly pressure right at the heart of Europe with this conflict, this Russian aggression in Ukraine. We've heard 2 different versions of the future of neutrality. Sweden, Finland, others will have different perspectives, but certainly a worthwhile hour to have spent with both of you. I thank you for this panel. I thank Dylan for coming up and shedding his perspective on the issue, because we have a big logistical maneuver to undertake together in just a few seconds. Let me just go ahead and cue the outro video and let you go on to your respective split sessions.